We'll start the third panel now on time. Two great papers again, and we'll start with the one by Carolyn Abbott and Akil Singla.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Jeff for organizing this amazing event. I'm going to be talking about some research with my co-author, Akil Singla, and I that we've been doing on municipal bankruptcy. So this paper, Service Solvency and Quality of Life After Municipal Bankruptcy. It's our second paper on municipal bankruptcy, and it's focused on understanding patterns of public service provision under conditions of extreme fiscal distress and resource scarcity. So basically, we want to know what happens when you loosen resource constraints, when you loosen the budget constraint on governments and on policymakers. So what do policymakers do when they're given the option to more or less remake their fiscal landscape? So this paper wants to understand not so much the relationship between fiscal stress and fiscal outcomes, but more the relationship between policy choices that are taken in response to fiscal stress and fiscal outcomes. So we really can't and won't say too much about the source of the fiscal stress that these municipalities experience. So much has been written on this, and it's ultimately not what we're interested in. I will say that what municipalities experience is very much unlike what states and, of course, what the federal government experiences. Local governments have much harder, much stronger budget constraints because of laws that limit borrowing and that limit their options for raising revenue. Of course, the federal government can also print their own money, which puts it in a whole other ballpark. So while we're not controlling for the source of the fiscal stress that a government experiences, we believe that the fiscal stress itself is the defining feature of the decision-making landscape. What can we do during periods of scarcity with very few options? And what we want to know is what happens when a government picks the bankruptcy option, right? What happens when these very fiscally similar governments that are in deep, deep distress choose to pursue bankruptcy, and what happens to those that do not. And it's totally plausible that the kind of decision makers who pursue bankruptcy are going to be different than those who choose to not pursue bankruptcy. And that's the ultimate, in my mind, the ultimate motivating aspect of this overall project. Maybe Akil doesn't totally agree with me, but that's, in my mind, what we ultimately want to know in this overall research agenda is why Chapter 9 is used so infrequently. It may very well be that the type of policymaker in charge of this decision is ultimately more determinative of fiscal outcomes than the policy in and of itself. But that tells us something, right? What does bankruptcy get us? Or just as important, what do the types of governments that would pursue bankruptcy get us? And this really became a central mystery for me when I was doing research on the politics of the New York City fiscal crisis of the 1970s. But the puzzle became more pronounced in my mind after the fiscal distress that local governments experienced in the wake of the Great Recession, particularly if you want to compare really somewhat stark differences between a place like Detroit, which was allowed to file for bankruptcy, and a place like Flint, Michigan, which was not, and wound up poisoning 12,000 children with tainted water in order to save some money. But all of that, honestly, is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what we're going to see over the next year or two if federal relief for states and governments, states and local governments doesn't come quite quickly. So the question is, what are the consequences of filing versus not filing for bankruptcy? And the consequences I am particularly interested in, and this paper is particularly interested in, is the impacts on residents' quality of life. What are their lived experiences? And really, what do governments do with this ability to effectively loosen or change their budget constraint to remake their fiscal landscape? And just as a little bit of additional background before I move on to the next slide, I think it's important to point out that debt is one of the oldest and most enduring features of communal societies. It's downright biblical. The ancients talk about these periodic debt jubilees where all would be forgiven of the obligations that they owed one another, where the tablets, where the contracts were literally written, would be smashed. So this idea of declaring bankruptcy, of being given this opportunity to start fresh, is definitely not new. And the contemporary federal bankruptcy code, which was passed after the Great Depression, is not the first iteration of an American bankruptcy law either. But it is the first iteration that allows some sort of relief for local municipal governments. And this is chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. It's one of the most generous pieces of financial law that has ever passed in this country. In order to be eligible for federal bankruptcy protection, a local government has to be allowed to file by the state, which is a consequence of the 10th Amendment. And they have to want to adjust their debts, their obligations. They have to be unable to negotiate with their creditors without the help of bankruptcy court. And importantly, the government has to be insolvent. Now, this insolvency requirement may seem obvious on its face, but it's actually a little more complicated than you might think. So what does it mean to be insolvent? The traditional interpretation of this term has meant financial insolvency, meaning that a government has to be unable to meet its financial obligations either now or in the very near future. But recent court decisions, most notably those in relation to Stockton and Detroit, indicated that judges might be more open to a more generous interpretation of the term, particularly with regard to service delivery. As a result, many believe now that solvency includes some version of service solvency, financial insolvency, as well as service insolvency, or the inability to deliver adequate services and publicly provided goods to residents. So, okay, great. What does adequate delivery mean? The judge in the Detroit case pointed to the city's skyrocketing crime rate and the city's inability to solve crimes in a timely manner. And that seems to be a pretty universal expectation of a general purpose municipal government, right? Keep your people safe, solve crimes. And luckily, this is also something we have a bit of data on. There are certainly other things that we might expect a government to do as well, though. Things like pave roads, keep street lights on. But there are actually fewer of these things than you might think that wouldn't also contaminate this concept with citizen tastes or preferences, right? We talked about this earlier in the conference, in the symposium. How do you disentangle what a government can do versus what the people want the government to do? It's a difficult thing to do. Measuring these things has proven, things like paving roads and keeping the streetlights on, measuring these things has proven to be nearly impossible unless you have ideas, which we would love to hear. And I do think to some degree we're talking about administrative capacity, but service solvency is almost simpler than that, because after it snows, everyone wants their government to plow the roads, right? This is not going to be endogenous to any sort of preference or any preference for snow plowing or result in any sort of Chibo-style distribution of service delivery across municipalities. But not everyone needs snow plowing, right? I use this example because half of our observations are in California. And it's unclear how we'd be able to measure something like time to clear roads or percentage of roads cleared over many municipalities in many years. Traditional measures of service solvency simply calculate something like taxes per capita and say, oh, if that number is higher than it is for other governments, that means this government is less service solvent than other governments. But this is definitely not the definition we want for all of the reasons I just mentioned. So in many ways, we need to fundamentally rethink how to more appropriately measure the ability of a government to meet the basic needs and not the preferences of its constituents. So one of the things that focusing on municipal bankruptcy allows us to do is to also see if there are any ideological patterns of service provision, at least under periods of extreme scarcity. There has been some really excellent work done on understanding the role of partisanship at the local level, of course, but I don't think as much on the role of ideology, because most municipalities in the United States are going to be run by ostensibly non-partisan policymakers. So if a government is given the opportunity to nearly wholly remake their fiscal landscape, how do policymakers react if they don't have partisanship to lean on? Do they use this moment of extreme uncertainty as an excuse to engage in ideological austerity, permanently shrinking the size of government, making these deep cuts in essential services and contracting out to the private sector? Or do they use this moment to prevent those sorts of cuts and their impact on some of the most vulnerable, their most vulnerable constituents? So what are policymakers doing with this newfound power where almost anything is possible? So the first thing we did was create a data set of municipalities that filed for Chapter 9 protection and a data set of very similar municipalities within the same states that did not file for Chapter 9. And we were able to do this by leveraging a very large comprehensive data set from the United States Common Census GovRank project. And this project compiled audited financial data from over 8,000 municipalities between 2009 and 2014. We used a matching algorithm to find the variables that were most likely to predict bankruptcy. These things, net asset ratios, operating ratios, the size of the municipality's population, and how dense the municipality was. Using those variables, we then found other municipalities that were very similar on these dimensions and can conceivably act as a comparison group to the bankrupt municipalities. And I'll show you in the next slide the results of the algorithm and the municipalities we used to form the control group. So we chose to find 5 control municipalities for each bankrupt municipality. This is kind of an arbitrary decision, but expanding the size of those groups doesn't do anything to decrease our standard errors. What drives the size of our standard errors is the number of treated observations, which of course we can't control. This might change in the wake of the COVID recession, whatever we're calling that right now. But for now, all we have are these treated observations from the wake of the Great Recession. We were also limited in that we wanted to compare bankrupt municipalities to similarly distressed localities within the same state. That meant we were drawing a lot of observations from California, since half of the bankruptcies occurred there. But it also meant we had to look within Rhode Island for cities and towns that were very similar to Central Falls, even though there aren't that many cities and towns in Rhode Island to begin with. So given all that, our limitations, we were pretty pleased with how well the balance on a number of different variables improved once we ran our matching algorithm. As you can see, looking at the balance on some of the key variables, we did a pretty decent job on improving the balance, which is represented by these little triangles. The closer the triangles are and the circles are to the dashed vertical line, the better the balance of the samples. The circles are the total sample. The 4 variables at the bottom that are in bold and italicized are our matching variables. And you can see we improved the balance on those quite a bit compared to the total sample. Total population. Yeah, the total population was the one that was the most difficult variable to improve, but we still improved it relative to the total sample. The other variables are variables that we control for in our analysis, but we did want to show that in general, those variables, which we might think of as being important for determining our outcome variables, are better balanced in the new sample, even though we didn't actually match on them. Okay, so once we settled on our list of municipalities and on our data set, we went out and collected the data that allowed us to compare a variety of different outcomes for these local governments. We collected a bunch of different line item expenditures from these financial reports, including total and general fund expenditures. We collected public safety expenditures, parks and rec, public works, sanitation, libraries, and capital outlay. We also collected data on revenue and revenue by source, but because we didn't find any effects, I'm not going to say anything more about them. And as I said, they all come from audited financial reports. We also collected data that would speak more explicitly to this question of service solvency and tell us something about actual government outputs and outcomes. And we settled on crime data for a variety of reasons. Most important being that the federal bankruptcy judges explicitly refer to public safety in their decisions, and also because it's the most readily available. So we looked at crime rates, which we don't find much of an effect on, unsurprisingly, and crime clearance rates. And both of the data come from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. And then we collected a bunch of additional control data from the census. So here is our raw data comparing non-bankrupt and bankrupt municipalities. So the vertical zero line centers the data series on the year in which the municipality either filed for bankruptcy or the year that the control governments experienced their fiscal year, their similar fiscal year to the bankruptcy. So this is going to be a staggered difference in differences, similar to what Julia and Maria presented before. In other words, all the year, in these pictures at least, all of the year-specific information has been removed from these data, and it's been replaced with period-specific information based upon how the municipality was from, how far the municipality was from their acute fiscal event. And we add the year-specific data back in when we do our analyses, our differences and event studies. In general, we see that the non-bankrupt municipalities, which are the red lines, generally spent less on all categories per capita than municipalities that eventually filed for protection. Similarly, looking at the crime data on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that non-bankrupt municipalities were also generally better at clearing or solving crimes, and that overall crime rates were lower. So as I said, the previous figures were raw data, and they were unadjusted for a variety of things. So we're trying to isolate the effect of filing for Chapter 9 protection, and we do this by using two different empirical models, staggered differences and an event study. Just very briefly, because we already kind of talked about this in the last presentation, but the staggered differences and differences looks at the difference in one of our outcome variables before and after the year of the acute fiscal event. And important and a little confusing to note is that for filing municipalities, this is the year of filing, but for non-filing municipalities, this is the year that was matched to the year that the municipalities filed. So for example, if we're talking about Stockton, the year it filed in 2012, we're comparing it to Sacramento in 2011, which is 1 year after 2010, which is the year that Sacramento's finances and population looked most similar to Stockton in the year 2011, which was 1 year before it filed. Right? It's kind of a little bit of a brain twister, but that's the nature of the staggered differences. It's not holding year constant until we add the year effects back in. So what the differences specification is good at telling us is whether there's this overall average effect from filing for bankruptcy over the post-treatment period. But we also look at how these differences change from year to year. And we do this in the event study, which I am not going to really present the results of because there are just so many variables and so many time periods. But it also allows us to test the parallel trends assumption. And like I said, I can talk more about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. It's in the paper, but we feel that the parallel trends assumption is generally satisfied. So finally, we have our main results. The left-hand side, we have the results from our spending outcomes, and these, and then on the right-hand side, we have the three different categories of our crime clearance rates. I'm not showing the results of the revenue outcomes of the crime rates because there are really no effects there. So in terms of our spending outcomes, we see declines in per capita spending across the board for municipalities that file for bankruptcy. The largest effects are felt on libraries, which declines half a standard deviation after filing for bankruptcy protection, and public safety spending, which declines 4/10 of a standard deviation. We also see declines in total and general fund expenses, but these effects are smaller, not in absolute terms, but in terms of the overall variation in our data. Other categories aren't really statistically significantly affected by the decision to file or not. The results for the effectiveness of the local police force, if that's what we want to call it, their ability to make arrests or solve crimes in relation to crimes that have been committed, I think are quite striking. In this model, we're actually controlling for the previous year's crime rates and spending on public safety. So we're really, I think, able to pretty well isolate the effect of municipal financial reorganization on the ability of the local government to solve crimes for their constituents. And we find that there is, across all categories of crime clearance rates, an improvement of about 3/5 of a standard deviation. Sorry, that's not true for property crime, for violent crime and total crime rates. For the case of violent crime clearance, local governments are making arrests at about 12 percentage points higher than they were before filing relative to other fiscally distressed localities. So they're solving 12% of their crimes more than they were before filing relative to other municipalities, which I think is something. So what does all of this mean for fiscally distressed local governments? We think there's a few key takeaways. First, bankruptcy results in cuts to spending relative to other fiscally stressed localities. This is pretty clear, I think, in the data. We don't have granular enough data to say exactly where those cuts are coming from, whether payroll is being cut or whether pension contributions are being deferred. But another thing I think we can say quite clearly is that those expenditure cuts may not actually have a detrimental effect on government performance, at least as it relates to public safety. And I don't want to overstate our findings, but I do think it's an interesting result, particularly now in this moment of discussing the ramifications of defunding the police or cutting expenditures on police and public safety, that cuts in public safety spending were actually accompanied by improvements in public safety performance, at least for these municipalities. There's likely some sort of management story going on here, that what happened to these police departments before and after filing for bankruptcy. We can't really speak to that. We don't really know what actually happened given the data that we have. What we would like to know is where we might find similar patterns in terms of government output and service solvency. This is almost certainly not going to be the case for libraries, right? Cutting library spending is not going to be accompanied by an increase in the number of books borrowed, almost certainly not. But figuring out how to measure service solvency on dimensions other than public safety is a huge issue for us, and one I think that we've really barely scratched the surface of, and we'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. So thank you so much for your time and giving us the opportunity to share this work with you.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Akil. We now move it over to Michael Census for the 6th and final paper.
Well, thanks everyone, and thanks so much, Jeff, for the invitation and for organizing this. It's really great to be with you all, and thanks everyone for writing such great papers and having such great comments so far. So I've become really interested in district attorneys over the past couple years, but actually starting to do research about it maybe in the past year. And so this is a paper about the link between district attorneys' preferences and the preferences of their voters. And one reason I'm interested in district attorneys is because of the phenomenon of mass incarceration and just the fact that most people who are in prison in the US are in state and local, or state prisons or local jails. And so we have to look at state and local policy to understand why this happened and to understand reform. And of course, who are the people that determine whether you go to prison or go to jail? Well, that's a lot of people actually, but one of the key people who does that is a locally elected official, typically elected, always local, called the district attorney. Sometimes also called the prosecutor, slightly different names in different states. So I'm going to call them just DAs for this paper and presentation. And so they have the power to decide who's going to be charged with what crimes and what crimes to charge them with. And of course, that's also going to translate into the severity of sentences and how long people can, who's going to go to prison and for how long. They have a lot of discretion, and there's a long-standing assumption that they're going to use this discretion to respond to public opinion, that they're hypersensitive to public opinion, and there's an assumption, or well, there's also evidence that for a long time, public opinion has been highly punitive in the US. And so by design, this office is meant to be very responsive to local public opinion. And so when state constitutional designers were deciding whether to have prosecutors, say, at the local level or state appointed, so one delegate to the Illinois State Constitutional Convention argued that you need a local DA because they'll have the understanding of the local community and be able to apply that to cases that come before them or cases they are involved with. We also have a lot of anecdotal evidence that DAs run on conviction rates and to appease punitive voters. And we hear a lot about that sort of in retrospect these days because there's supposedly this new reform era of more progressive reformist district attorneys who are trying to now respond to supposedly more progressive electorates who want criminal justice reform. And so, you know, the ACLU, for example, has been leading the charge on this. And if you look at their campaign materials, you know, they tell voters that DAs could end mass incarceration with the stroke of a pen, right? And so the logic is if no one gets charged, or if you decriminalize certain things, a lot less people will be sent to prison. But we have very little existing evidence that DAs do care about public opinion, or at least and sort of the standard measure we would use. And so I'm going to do that today. I think that's important for understanding how we got here in terms of the prison population, where we're going to go for criminal justice reform. And I think this is an interesting case as a sort of another local official, sort of limits of local representation here, why those occur, and what other lessons we can draw for ways that, as much as we like to use the local level as a lab, and of course I try to do that myself, that there can be limits to that. So I'm going to look at California between those years. I'll tell you why shortly, or at least I'll tell you more about that time period. And I'm going to look at ballot propositions on criminal justice reform issues, of which I have 9 over this period. Things like the death penalty, softening sentences, and I'll go through them. And so I'm just going to basically compare how voters voted on these issues to how their DAs took official positions on these issues, because often they did. And then I'm also going to look at other officials taking positions on these issues, on the same issues. Officials like local officials, mayors, state legislators, and members of Congress. And what I'm going to find is that DAs are both incongruent in the sense that they are on the wrong side of their voters frequently, and they're unresponsive in the sense that they don't, you know, more liberal places don't necessarily get more liberal DAs. And that's these two measures, that's both true in an absolute sense, but also relative to other types of elected officials. Okay, what do we know about representation? Well, we have a lot of evidence that there's responsiveness in Congress and state legislatures and cities and counties now. We have growing evidence of that. When people look at congruence, things tend to break down a little more. There seems to be a lot less congruence than there is responsiveness. I think it's important to think about, I go into this more in the paper and I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, but ways that DAs are different from other elected officials and why that might lead to weaker representation. And the key things I'm thinking of when I am doing this work here and other papers is that on one hand, there's limitations on the candidate pool. You have to be a lawyer to be a DA, and there's some evidence that if there's not a lot of lawyers in a jurisdiction, then there's less competition for these offices. But there are also limits potentially on the ideology of candidates who run for DA. So typically to win this type of election, you have experience as a prosecutor, so you have like a criminal justice mindset. And it might be hard for you to have that mindset and also be progressive on criminal justice issues. So this is something that Dan Thompson argues in his recent work on sheriffs, finding similarly unresponsive local officials there, or at least partisanship doesn't matter there, which suggests unresponsiveness. The other difference is I think voters might place a value on technical skill. And so voters might want someone who at least knows how to prosecute. And again, that might correlate with punitive ideology. So a voter might prefer an incongruent candidate who at least has the skill of prosecution when they need to actually prosecute, to a congruent candidate who doesn't have that skill. Okay, I have no evidence of either of those things here really, but that's what I'm thinking is going on here. So I look at California, which helps to just keep things homogeneous within a single state. DAs here represent at the county level, so there's 58, 1 DA per county. The elections are in June of midterm years, so in most jurisdictions, I know LA just had one, but San Francisco the year before, but most of them had them in 2018. They're typically in June. They're nonpartisan, and if necessary, those are runoff in November. So if no candidate gets above 50% in June, you go to a runoff in November. They have 4-year terms. The other thing that's nice about California, well, any particular state is nice for the homogeneity within the state. California is nice because it's passed a lot of, or it's considered a lot of criminal justice propositions in the 2010s. And so many of these issues are submitted to voters in referendums. All the referendums I'm looking at, and I believe all the referendums in this period are in November of even years. And lots of DAs and other officials take positions. And of course, I'm following other work in the study of representation that uses ballot propositions to study this issue. Though I'm doing it slightly different. One thing people typically do is on the official side, they look at the official decisions. I'm looking at the official's position that they take on the ballot issue. So that's a key difference, right? Why don't I look just at what the officials do? Okay, well, the DAs don't cast votes in a legislature. They do, however, make decisions about sentencing, maybe just link how voters think to that. I'm not doing that for a couple reasons. One is that sentencing data are really complicated, and so that presents you with lots of choices about what types of sentences to look at and how do you measure punitiveness and all that. Another is that as administrative data, we know now that if we wanted to study something like bias, we get a bias measure out of that. So this Knox Loma Moll paper looking at arrests, but really just the sentencing data come from a strategic process, right? And so there can be issues there. Voters don't make sentencing decisions. So if I want to look at congruence, the endorsements are useful there because they are on the same scale. And if I want to look at other officials, they might vote in the legislature, but they don't make sentencing decisions. So the endorsements, although I certainly can see they have limits, they have some advantages. Okay, limits. There's missingness. The missingness could be strategic. So feel free to ask me about that. Okay, so where I started in terms of getting the data is using the ACLU of California. In researching DAs, I noticed they had this website for voters, meetyourda.org, where they would tell voters, here are these 4 propositions that Californians voted on. And so, for example, the 3 strikes law, reform the sort of you get sentenced for life after your 3rd felony conviction. Get rid of that. 69% of Californians voted yes, and they point out that only 3 of 58 DAs in California supported, and sort of similarly out of step with the other issues they look at. So I started there. They had a pretty good list of DA positions on those 4, but I thought that maybe their selection of issues could be strategic. So I went back and just tried to see all the sort of criminal justice related issues that Californians voted on back to 2012, and I found 5 more. And usually I get the positions of where the DAs are from old campaign websites, sometimes or frequently from the Wayback Machine. So for example, this was one about gun control. And so these are DAs listed and also other officials listed as supporting this proposition. So ultimately, 9 propositions, they're listed here on the left. Just to give you an example. So there's 58 DAs in California. I have 39 that I have their positions on, say, death penalty repeal, Proposition 34 in 2012. So that's 67% of all DAs. I've got 19 local officials, so mayors or city councilors or county commissioners. So by one denominator, that's 4%. I've got 47 state legislator positions. I've got 10 member of Congress positions, House members from California. Here are the voter positions by county, and a darker gray means the voters voted more liberally. So just to go through these, death penalty repeal in 2012, there was a measure about human trafficking to increase sentences. So every county here, a majority wanted to do that. This measure also included the provisions that sex offenders' web histories would have to be publicly available. I think courts later took that out. But here's an issue where voters are actually on the punitive side. And for something like reforming 3 strikes, they're uniformly on the opposite side. Other things like make nonviolent offenses misdemeanors instead of felonies. There's more variation. Increasing parole. Again, repealing the death penalty 4 years later, about the same result. A measure about increasing gun control, legalizing marijuana, and the death penalty proponents, their alternative they proposed was don't repeal it, but just make it go faster. So regardless of whether a yes or a no is liberal or conservative, darker here means majority took the liberal position. Okay, so here are where the voters are, and here's where the DAs are. Okay. And so again, there's missing this because I don't have every DA taking a position. There's also some that take neutral positions, and I've just thrown them out. And so you see it's mostly light gray. When DAs take positions, they're typically on the conservative side with just a couple exceptions. And San Francisco and other coastal counties come up frequently. So what I'm going to look at is just comparing those two maps basically. And I'm going to do that also for other officials. And for the other officials, I've got the jurisdiction level voter opinion as well. So if I'm talking about House members, I'm talking about, liberalism in that House district. And if it's a county commissioner, it's liberalism in that county commission district. And I'm going to look at congruence, our DAs and voters on the same side, and then this cross-sectional responsiveness measure. Okay. Okay, so death penalty repeal. This is not one of the ones the ACLU pointed out. Congruence is actually pretty high here, but again, it's mainly because DAs almost uniformly take the conservative position, and voters, there's some counties in favor, but there's a lot of counties that oppose the death penalty repeal, and they sort of happen to have conservative DAs. Okay. Similarly with the human trafficking. Okay, on something like 3 strikes, voters uniformly on the liberal side, but only 3 DAs on the liberal side, so 19% of the time congruent. Okay, and then you can see the slopes, and I think the basic pattern is sometimes they're positive, but they're always kind of weak, and sometimes they're totally flat, and sometimes they're not actually slopes because there's like legalizing marijuana, there's no variation in where the DA stood. Next thing I'll do is pool everything and do some statistical tests and some comparison across offices. First, in terms of congruence. So what I'm going to do is just make the observation a position taken by an official who represents a jurisdiction. So I have 259 of those for DAs, et cetera, for the other ones. And for congruence, I'm going to ask what proportion of the issues taken are on the same side as the voters per office. And I'm interested to test this against, well, testing across offices is interesting, but also just across, against a sort of a null of 50%, right? Sort of representation by luck. So that's why the confidence intervals are here. And here's the result. Okay, so DAs, I think it's about 58% of the time they're congruent. The 95% confidence interval does cross 50%, so we can't reject sort of half the time at conventional levels, but we can for all the other types of offices. And we see that, in fact, as we get closer to House members are sort of, going up levels, we see stronger congruence or more frequent congruence. Another way to characterize this as sort of being coincidental for DAs is to plot an indicator for congruence against voter liberalism. So what does that tell us? Well, for someone like, say, U.S. House members on the bottom right, like you might imagine that if voters are conflicted, if they're, if the constituency is around 50%, it's going to be harder for the House member to take a congruent position. And so we've got this kind of U shape here where non-congruence is more likely as you get closer to 50%. And that's true for local and state legislator, but not for DA. DA, it's just if you are in a conservative constituency, you get the benefit of a DA who's on your side because almost all the DAs are conservative. If you're in a liberal constituency, you're very unlikely to have a congruent DA. So it's just a negative relationship with liberalism. Okay, then I'm gonna just show you this quickly, do the same comparison or the same sort of data structure, but measure responsiveness. So just regress an indicator for whether the DA takes the liberal position 0 or 1 on voter percent in favor of the liberal position. So the coefficients are, how does the probability of taking the liberal position change as voter opinion increases by 1 percentage point in terms of their liberalism? Okay. And so here's DAs. It's maybe the table's in the paper, but it's less than 0.01. And it's a lot bigger for all the other offices, right? And it's also more precisely estimated for all the other offices as well. Okay, so you can think of that earlier plot with the 9 panels. This is just kind of the average. This represents the average across all those issues of that slope that we saw. And this, I'm not showing you issue by issue, but average for the other offices. Okay, so the conventional wisdom is that DA candidates have had to, and maybe a lot of the time still do, have to appear tough on crime to win votes. These results suggest DAs are in fact unresponsive to public opinion. They can regularly take public positions contrary to voters and essentially get away with it. This is consistent with recent work. Again, Dan Thompson's work about sheriffs, slightly different, but he finds that the party of a sheriff has no difference for immigration enforcement. This could be something about local criminal justice officials. And again, the candidate pool and the fact that to be a professional criminal justice official might the path there might lead to just be conservative, and it's hard to change that. This could also generalize this non-responsiveness and sort of weaker responsiveness compared to other offices. That could generalize. I mean, that's something I think people think for a lot of reasons could happen at the local level. And I think one of the reasons it might happen here and in other offices is because that, these officials are different in the sense of there's this technical skill that goes along with there's this managerial component, right? And so if voters value this, and especially in cases like this, if the professionalization that leads to that experience brings with it this ideology, then that can weaken responsiveness for a lot of these offices. All right, thanks.
All right, thank you, Michael. We'll now turn it over to John Matsasaka for comments on the 2 papers.
Okay, so if this works, you can see me in there too, which is that working? Okay, so it breaks a little bit of the tedium of having to stare at static slides for hour after hour. Okay, so thanks, Jeff, for inviting me to do this. It's good to see some of you I know, some of you I don't. Liz, it'd be great to see you in person out here. I'm sorry you have snow. I went outside. It's 89 degrees in South Pasadena right now, so I'm not telling you that for any reason other than make you feel bad. But we'll get you out here next year. But it's good to see everybody.
It worked.
So Jeff, thank you also for letting me discuss these particular papers, because not only are they things that I'm interested in, they're actually very interesting in and of their own right. They're asking really good questions, and they're actually being executed in a very good way. So thinking about the discussion, what I think, there's 2 ways to do discussions or do comments at conferences. There's the kind of referee report approach, and then there's the discuss the big picture themes of the conference approach. So I'm actually going to do both here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of some of the papers, but then end up with some bigger, more kind of conceptual comments about that these papers may be suggesting about some of the issues at this conference here. And I'm going to just go in reverse order here. So let me start with Michael's paper. He did a great job presenting it, so there's not much else needs to be said. He's got these DA endorsements, as you know, on California ballot propositions, and he's comparing those endorsements to the majority views in their districts. And I guess the takeaway findings are that the congruence is about 58% for DAs. And if you look at other officials on the same types of issues, they're much higher. They're 67 to 86%, depending on the issues. And the way he summarizes it is that district attorneys are systematically out of step with their constituents. And not only that, but they're out of step in a particular direction. They're not just kind of randomly out of step, but they're systematically, I guess is why I use that word, is that they're tougher on crime. Okay, so let me, a couple things kind of, kind of more referee-ish comments, but maybe these are general comments as well. First of all, just thinking about congruence here, I think we're now getting a series of papers, of which I've done some as well, that suggest that low congruence is the norm. It appears, at least for state and local governments. And I just, since it's my discussion, I just extracted this this figure, which is in my book, where it came out last year, but it combines some various results. But for those of you who aren't following the congruence literature, I can just very easily explain what this is talking about. We're basically looking at how some sort of elected official, what it does compared to what that person's constituents want to have happen. And if the official is perfectly congruent, then we should see it perfectly represented. We should see 100% congruence. That would be kind of majority always rules. That's that left bar. If they just choose policy by flipping a coin, we should see 50% congruence. So that's like totally ignoring what your constituents want at all. Just flip a coin, you're going to get 50%. And I'm just mentioning that because the baseline here isn't 0, it's 50%. So when he shows you a 58% number, one should recognize that that's not compared to 0, that's compared to 50% is probably a reasonable baseline. So I wrote a paper, and Lax and Phillips wrote a paper. We did almost exactly the same thing. They actually have a much more expansive data set, which I like quite a bit. But we found basically the same thing. I found about 59% congruence, and this was just looking at state policies and opinion in the states. They found 48%. If you combine the two studies together, there's 2150 policy decisions. It's about 50% congruence. So if you just look at the states, you get almost like coin flipping. And since then, there's been some other studies. There was an interesting paper on the minimum wage that found pretty low congruence. But this seems to be the general pattern, is that policies and the actions of elected officials seem remarkably disconnected from majority opinion. It's so measured. And then we're seeing that in a bunch of different ways. So I think that the 58% number in some ways is kind of, it's surprising and just perhaps disturbing, but in a way it's almost like what you'd expect if you've been following this literature now. So I think the question is, why are we seeing this? Why do we see low congruence? That is the question of the day in a lot of these studies. So one thing I would like to see the paper do more of is to try to dig that out a little bit. Ultimately, that's a causal question, and that's maybe beyond the scope of what you can do here. But I'd still like to see some correlational things, and I think some ideas have been thrown out even within the paper that I would like to know. You might be able to say some things about. One is that we see low congruence because of just information conditions. So most voters don't actually know most voters probably don't even know what a district attorney does, let alone what the candidates are in a typical election. They don't know what their past person did. Who knows? Probably the police know, probably the lawyers in the community know, but most regular people probably don't really know. So these are classic low information elections where we expect that their monitoring is not going to work very good. But I wonder if there's some way to get at variation in information conditions across, at least in the cross section. Are there some jurisdictions where we think there's better information than others? That might at least give us a hint of whether part of what's happening here is because of low information. Another thing that kind of comes up out of the previous literature is that there's probably a difference between new and settled issues. And what I mean by that is that when we typically measure congruence, we're looking at issues that are in the news or controversial or somebody's talking about. So they're taking an opinion survey. That's not the whole set of issues. If we looked at the whole set of issues, congruence would be really, really high, because almost all issues everybody agrees on. Should murder be illegal? Everybody agrees. Congruence is one on that issue. Nobody even takes a survey on those issues. So if you took a survey on kind of the universe of issues, you'd see very high congruence. In some sense, where it seems to be breaking down is on sort of new or controversial issues of some sort. So, and that's particularly relevant in this issue, which is relying on ballot propositions. But there might be a way to get at that, because some of these issues maybe have been around. Especially issues which are voted on more than once, which would be like the death penalty. You might see, is this changing over time as it becomes a familiar issue? So you might be able to get some hints on that. And the third thing that the paper mentions is this notion, well, maybe there just aren't that many, the pool of candidates is too thin. There aren't enough people who could run. Voters aren't going to get enough choices. I guess I'm kind of dubious of this, but you could certainly proxy for this by the number of lawyers, by the population, the community. I mean, there's ways to try to get at that. Again, not really tight stuff, but suggestive if it looks like there might be some correlates with this. My one kind of main concern with what's being done here is the use of, and maybe it's more of an interpretive question, but it's the use of DA's endorsements on ballot propositions as a way to measure their congruence. And my concern is that voters are hiring DAs to charge people who are accused of crimes, to make decisions about how to pursue those things. Their job isn't to endorse ballot propositions. So it's not clear to me that them giving a different opinion than the voters means they're not representing their voters. The voters didn't put them in there to do that. In fact, it could well be that they're doing their job by telling the voters, look, I'm an expert. You want my opinion? Here it is. You don't have to do what I say, but I'm going to give you my opinion. And in some ways, I almost think, isn't that leadership? Isn't leadership partly trying to persuade people of what they should do? So again, it would be a little bit different if the DAs were not enforcing the laws that the voters had passed. So the voters approved a proposition and the DA didn't do it. That I think is a breakdown in representation. But this is the decision where the voters are deciding. They're hearing different opinions. The DA is throwing his or her opinion into the mix, saying, "Here, you want my opinion? Here it goes." Saying that they're giving a different opinion might be a reflection of kind of their sentiments on what they think the correct law should be, but it's not clear to me that it says anything about whether they're shirking or whether they're doing their job as representatives. So I don't know where to go with that exactly, but it was something that it kept rolling around in my head. Yeah. Let me say a little bit about life after bankruptcy, and then say some general things. And I think I said at the beginning, but I do want to underscore, I like both of these papers quite a bit. So these notwithstanding, I'm going to raise some questions. Again, Carolyn did an excellent job presenting. I think it was really clear, and so I don't really need to summarize it. So I'm glad I didn't write much here. But basically, she's looking at how city services responded after 6 cities declared bankruptcy during the Great Recession. She quickly mentioned that they're using audited financial statements, but those of you who tool around in these data know that that's a non-trivial thing. That's actually a nice innovation instead of using the standard census data, which is only every 5 years and doesn't have much great information. So I think that's actually I just want to call that out as a significant contribution in its own right. Then they're going to use propensity scores to find a comparison group. That's all good. And then I guess the takeaways would be that the effects of bankruptcy, again, as with all causal things, you have to buy the comparison group. But taking these as effects, expenditures going down when they go into bankruptcy, particularly public safety expenditures. There's no change in crime rates. And what I think is perhaps the most striking finding is that it looks like at some level the efficiency of the police force is going up. There's the crime clearance is going up by a rather substantial number, 8 to 12%. So that's in a nutshell. Obviously, they do much more than that, but that's in a nutshell. So the tentative explanation that's put out here is that this is happening because bankruptcy occurs because a city has made a bunch of financial agreements, primarily with creditors, but also with other people like public employees. They made a bunch of financial agreements, and those agreements they actually can't follow through on their financial agreements, particularly to the creditors. They don't have the money to make the payments on the interest, and so they have to do something else. And so what they have to do is they have to abrogate or renegotiate some of those contracts, some or all of those contracts. There's kind of no other way around it. So the explanation they suggest is that, well, partly it's allowing the cities to perhaps abrogate contracts with public sector employees, possibly unions, that are inefficient in some unspecified way, and so that they're able to pay them less, but still get not only get better performance not only get the same performance, but actually get better performance out of them. And that's an oversimplification, but I think that's the idea that's kind of hinted at here. And I want to return to that in a little bit. Let me just mention a few econometric things, because this paper, they actually think very carefully about the econometrics here, which is quite good. So propensity score matching, they're matching on financial and demographic variables. Of course, it's the standard limitation of this, that you're matching on observables. You can't match on unobservables by definition. That just has to be acknowledged. I am troubled by that though, because it is leaving out kind of political things, and it's leaving out the things that kind of let you go down this path in the first place. So I'm not sure there's much to be done about that. I might have liked to see some political variables thrown in the match too. What could be done though, perhaps, the problem is there really aren't that many cases here. There's only 6 cases, and so that's the way it is. And I believe that 6 is better than 0. So that's fine. You're not going to get 1,000 cases here, but I'm concerned about the matching. So it might be interesting to sort of make me feel better. It'd be nice if, one idea I was just thinking about, could you do some sensitivity analysis? Pick a completely different set of cities to match with, and do it again, and see if it changes anything. Something like that. I'm not quite sure what to do. You're never going to get 100%, but I would like to see something a little bit about this. The effect on the increase, not only is the efficiency of the police seeming to be going up, it's going up by rather a huge amount. It's going up to such an amount that I'm actually finding it implausible. I'm not saying it can't be true, but it's one of those ones that's striking me as so large as to be almost unbelievable. It's hard for me to believe you can cut police spending by a huge amount, and not only do they hold constant, but they do better at their job. It could be. I'm not saying that, but part of me makes me wonder if there's something else going on in there. So I'd like to see more effort to smoke out all the other possibilities there. Winsorizing is an obvious thing to me. There's only 6 observations. Look at them really carefully. Is it coming out of really one city that made a dramatic change and you can drill into it? I just want to know more about that. It seems to me you could probably also get data on employment and possibly on wages. I don't know if you can get it at the periodicity you want, so that's going to be the issue. But that would allow you to back out if they're cutting police expenditures and cutting number of employees, then it really is going to surprise the heck out of me if they can actually increase their performance. If they're holding employment and paying them less, maybe, or if they're maybe even increasing employment and paying them less, I could maybe understand it, but maybe you could shed a little more light in there. Another kind of econometric thing, but when I look at the pre-trans, I'm okay with the pre-trans, but there are really big differences in levels of some of the key outcome variables, which are suggesting these cities are starting in very different positions, and that's troubling me a little bit when I see them reacting differently. So I would like a little more thought about that. And then kind of just the last, maybe more of a conceptual question, there is a difference between bankruptcy and financial distress. And the paper is aware of that, and there's some attempt to kind of get on that, to kind of think a little bit about that. But I guess I wish that was brought a little bit into the front, because is it the financial distress that's really doing this? Just if you get in bad trouble, is that the problem, or is it really something about the ability to abrogate contracts in some kind of way? What is it? It's kind of dancing around in there, but I kind of wish it might be brought a little more to the front. Okay. So those are kind of detailed comments on both the papers. I want to just now, in the last minute or two, just say a couple more broader things that I was thinking about as a result of the papers, which I think apply to some of the other papers in the conference too. But one of the big questions which I think is coming up out of these papers and many others is the question of why aren't citizens being better served by their elected officials or by their governments? I think this is a question that's kind of begged by these. And I think this is actually particularly interesting because it's a broader trend. Okay, we've all heard about populism. Populism is some notion that, the government's been taken over by elites or by the 1% or by technocrats or somebody who knows but there's a lot of dissatisfaction, and we see it in opinion surveys that people have declining trust in government. They don't think it works for them. You can ask the question a whole bunch of different ways. But this is happening at all different points within our democracies nowadays, where people perceive that governments don't really work for them. So I think these papers, in their own narrow and deliberately narrow and for meritorious reasons, narrow ways, are touching onto a big question. And so it'd be interesting to me to see them push a little bit toward that that bigger question. So in the DA's question, I would put it as this: if voters really want tougher on crime, if they don't want such tough on crime DAs, why do they keep electing them? That's the question. How does this happen? The bankruptcy question, and I think the bankruptcy question is that if you look at these bankruptcies, they're not things that just kind of came out of the blue. Kind of woe is me, we got into bankruptcy. These things usually occur because of corruption or incompetence. They're caused by elected officials. Jefferson County, of course, which is one of the biggest ones, which they have in their sample, was blatant corruption across the board. Detroit, it's hard to get away. There's some sort of mismanagement, some sort of catering to public sector unions, promising them more money than anybody could really promise with a declining economic base and so forth. And a lot of the pension crises have that flavor of elected officials making promises that they really shouldn't have made. It really wasn't going to work. So again, the question is, why are voters continuing to get or elect corrupt or myopic officials? So that's the broad question. Let me just, in my last slide here, because I want to be mindful of Jeff's timing here, but let me just suggest theoretically what are kind of the stories that are on the table here that we might think about. The first one is that there's some sort of myopia that works in here. And maybe it's myopia on the part of voters, that they don't really understand what's going on. They have short-term things. You know, maybe it's just myopia on the part of politicians, that they expect to be out of office, so they don't mind making a promise to a public sector union to give them a huge retirement pay that they know the city can't pay because they're going to be out of office. So maybe there's something going on there. That's one idea that I think is worth pursuing. There's a second idea, and I think it's running around in the background of Michael's paper, and I would call it the citizen candidate model in some sense. So what do we think elections do? Do we think elections are selecting people or providing incentives? So there's one theory, which of course goes back to, Madison, which says that elections are there to provide incentives. We're going to get people to represent us because they're worried about being kicked out of office. But there's a set of other models, and I'm not going to mention. I didn't put them on here, but guys like Beasley and Code and Osborne and Slavinsky have written citizen candidate models that say no, elections are just selecting. You select people. They tell you what they're going to do, you select them, and they just do what they're going to do. It's hardwired into them. And I think Michael kind of has that idea in mind, that you elect these guys and they are what they are, and they don't really care about anything. So it could be that's what democracy is. It's just electing citizen candidates. But that strikes me as another kind of broad conceptual area that one could plow into. Is that what it is? We're just getting citizen candidates who just do what they want to do. Finally, and the last one, and this is actually the one that is one of my favorites. Not that I like it, but I suspect is a lot of the story is interest groups, and I think that's running around in the background of a lot of these things. We have a feeling that there's some groups are more influential in local governments than others, particularly city governments, which are kind of low information things. If you just look at the media, they're sort of 99.99% of media coverage in the last year has been about the presidential election, and 0.001% has been about any local election or pretty much state election. So voters pretty much know nothing about what's going on at the local level. So that's kind of a breeding ground for interest groups to get in there and have undue influence. It's the police unions or the teachers unions or the developers. They're the only people who are paying attention. So it's possible that they have undue influence, and they're the ones that get these deals formed, to get these cities into trouble, or get these political actors to deviate from the majority. So that strikes me as the other thing that might go toward unraveling why we seem to be getting low representation here. So I just throw those out there because I think thematically some of the other papers about local government are on the same topic. These issues kind of pop up here. So I think the way to answer these questions is going to be with studies like the ones we've seen, which are taking really specific cases, drilling into them really carefully. And so it's great to see those papers. And I think at some level, our job as scholars is going to be to triangulate and add all those things up over time and see what big picture emerges. So again, great papers. I encourage you all to read them, and I'm very glad I had the chance to read them. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Before we move on to some questions, and we have 4 hands raised and a question or 2 in the chat, I'd like to give the authors a chance to respond. Carolyn, Nikhil, anything you want to say?
So thank you so much for those comments. They were truly fantastic. The one thing I really want to make sure I responded to was about the implausibility of the size of the effects, which I totally get, and I totally think that these are pretty substantive effects. We don't know exactly what they're cutting at of public safety. So our theory is that it's pension contribution deferrals, which would probably not actually impact the size of the workforce or the quality of the workforce that much. Just doing some very, very initial research into what's going on. I see these articles. Like there's an article about Mammoth Lakes where they're talking about having to lay off all of these police officers. So if that is a in the wake of filing or about to file for bankruptcy, if that is a motivating force in some way to the police force, we have to prove to Mammoth Lakes, to our employers, that we're worth it, that we need to stay, because right now they're cutting our pensions, but they're threatening to start laying us off. So if there's some sort of motivation going on. The other thing that we can observe is if they're just cutting some, capital investment from public safety expenditures, which I mentioned, I had on my slide, but didn't really mention, kind of demilitarizing the police by spending less on, these armored vehicles or these machine guns. We don't know, and I truly wish we had more data. And if anyone has any ideas on how to get to some of that, I don't know, Akil, if you want to add anything.
Yeah. So again, John, thanks for the fantastic comments on some of these changes that might be driving these large effect sizes in policing. So one of the things, again, it's difficult to sort of get the data to nail this down econometrically, but one of the things that you can see when you read the case studies of bankruptcy, which is really the predominant literature out there on bankruptcy in governments or case studies, what we can see is that these events actually do generate coverage, and I think they drive some political change. And so one of the case studies that I've seen on Stockton talks about how there was a community policing reform effort. And Stockton happens to be one of the cases where the judge really identified high crime rates as being the reason why the city was insolvent. Vallejo, which isn't in our sample for some data reasons, there's a really robust case study that talks about how a new crop of city councilors was elected during the bankruptcy process, and they really focused on reform, including targeting some law enforcement stuff. So I think those are some of the mechanisms that are going on here. I do wish that we could do more beyond sort of pointing to those events, but I think that that's driving at least some of the story here.
I won't go specific. I just say thanks so much, John, for those comments, and both on my paper. And I think the broader discussion was really interesting too. I guess maybe one thing I'll say is I think the angle about isn't this just leadership? I think that's interesting to consider. I mean, I think I have some behavioral evidence, but I don't think it doesn't really fit in this paper. That what I said about voters maybe preferring the incongruent qualified candidate to the congruent unqualified candidate, that could be true. I think maybe also in keeping with that, the ACLU, this was part of a larger campaign to to field a bunch of kind of Soros connected candidates in these California races, and I think almost all of them, well, they didn't do very well. So it could be that like you said, I mean, this is about leadership, and maybe this is, for that office, it kind of is about being a leader. That said, I think in the context of studying representation and in the sense of correspondence between opinions and how we typically do it, this is again very contrary to that. And so I guess I'll think more about whether that's interpretation or something else. But thanks.
Becca, you're first.
Hi, thank you so much for these two excellent papers. As to the first paper, the one about bankruptcies, it was so interesting. I learned a lot. I sometimes feel like me and Mike are two of the only people who cared about police budgets before this past summer. And so just to that end, I just wanted to mention that I think your story about cuts to pensions and other kind of personnel costs like overtime is exactly right. In most cities, north of 95% of the annual police budget is personnel, including pension expenditures. So there's just kind of no, if you need to cut, there's almost no sense in cutting anything else besides personnel, like overtime and pensions and the salary for newly hired officers. So I think you're exactly on the right track. And as to the crime clearance rates for property crimes and violent crimes, I do think the effect sizes look kind of large, but I'm very encouraged by the fact that you see the effects for violent crimes and not property crimes. And I just, if you don't know about it, wanted to kind of direct you to a criminological literature about so-called investigative effort and whether investigative effort actually matters in clearing crimes. There are some people who think it really doesn't matter at all, that whether you clear a crime or not is based on kind of something random, like was there an eyewitness, or when the burglar broke into your house, did he cut his hand, and then there's blood evidence that the police can use. Some people think investigation just doesn't matter for those reasons, and other people think it matters, but mostly for violent crimes, because for a property crime, like if someone steals your car, you don't know who did that. But for any violent crime besides homicide, you can say like, oh, so-and-so is the person who hit me. And so in any case, I think if investigative effort matters at all, it's going to matter more for violent crimes than property crimes. So it's very encouraging to me that you see those effects for violent crimes and not for property crimes.
Okay, Julia.
Thank you so much.
I also really liked these papers, and it's neat to see some sort of synergy between, the various papers presented just in the symposium. And Carolyn, Maria, and I've spent so much time trying to think about how to measure public service provision as, an interesting outcome and throwing our hands up. And so thank you for introducing this new data. I was wondering, are there ever cities that file for bankruptcy but don't get granted it, or cities that discuss it in city council meetings but don't actually file? And just, as John mentioned, maybe using just different sets of control cities to sort of probe the robustness of the estimates could be interesting. And then, again, as people have been saying, you could turn the fact that there's only these 6 treated cities into a strength, because you can basically do the case study for each city or even just a few of them. And I know all of your work is on pensions, and you have like a really rich understanding of what is going on. So you might as well incorporate a little bit of that. But I also learned a lot. And then just for Mike, I wonder if this goes back to Jessica's point about how, liberal voters, they're happy to vote for liberal policies at the federal and state level, but then God forbid you build affordable housing in their neighborhoods. And is this a similar thing where for the state level criminal justice ballots, voters are professing to be very liberal, but they want law and order in their communities. But yeah, thank you guys both so much.
Okay, Liz.
Thank you guys for such great papers. I learned a lot. On the bankruptcy paper, wow, I really learned a lot because I know so little about this. And I love what you guys are doing. Of course, the fact that you've only got 6 sort of treated observations or 6 cases is a challenge, but I totally agree with Julia's comment that you can leverage that and just do a much richer job analyzing that qualitative data, that tons of quantitative data that you have, but in more of a qualitative way. The one question that came to mind while I was listening to your presentation is, what's the right time period in which we would expect to see the consequences of bankruptcy? And particularly if it's in the area, if it's in restructuring debt, that plays out over a long time period. I do know a bit about the bankruptcy in Detroit. I hate to keep bringing up Detroit, but I happen to know a decent amount about it. And what has happened over time is, in the short term, being able to restructure that debt, particularly pension debt, had a pretty substantial short-term effect. I don't know if it shows in the data, but what's believed to be the big implication of that is it restored the business sector's confidence in city government and has led to a huge increase in economic development. And with that, of course, tax revenue and new residents moving downtown and drops in crime and, on the other hand, gentrification and, so it's not all good, but that's been 10 years. Well, it's been 6 years, I guess, in Detroit. So I worry a little bit about stopping the time series too soon, because I do think you're going to see effects quite a bit further into the future. And maybe you can, again, do more with that on a sort of a case study basis as opposed to in the quantitative data. And then in Michael's, one of the things that came to mind to me is, could you look at re-election rates for these DAs and assess the extent to which incongruent DAs are punished by voters? So again, we know that that's not a perfect mechanism either of holding elected officials accountable, but at least it would give us a sense of, at another point in the process, are voters citizens feeling like they're not being well represented by these DAs. Now, of course, there are lots of other factors that are going to come into play in terms of whether they're actually not reelected. But if you see a relationship there, I think that provides a little bit stronger evidence to you that on some important dimension, local voters are not being well represented by these elected officials. The other alternative, if you don't see that, another alternative explanation is simply that it's a mismatch, and this came up both in John's comments and Julia's, a mismatch in the data that, it's not these state level ballot propositions that matter in terms of how local voters evaluate DA candidates, but it's on something else that they do. And their position on these ballot measures is sort of extraneous to how they evaluate the jobs. So I do think that trying to really figure out, are voters disappointed in the DAs that they get when they show up as incongruent in your data would help you make that claim a lot more strongly.
Thad?
First, I really did enjoy both papers, and they're going to be extremely timely as we move towards, as you said, Carolyn, another round of bankruptcies and increasing focus on district attorneys and ending mass incarceration. So I learned a lot from both, but I just wanted to kind of join this conversation that John started about what's going on with representation and bring it to the local level. One thing that I just wanted to throw out there, and Michael, feel free to digest it or respond, is that everybody else you're comparing people to are elected officials who are lawmakers, right? They are sent to Congress to be mayors, to the state legislature to change the laws. And it could be possible, right, that district attorneys have a strong sense of their identity and their occupational norms as they are law enforcers, not lawmakers, right? And that what may be in some ways sort of a time-bound status quo bias that shows a conservative effect here is that they were being asked to endorse, easier on crime in their mind initiatives at a time when the current law was and that they were elected to uphold were these tough on crime initiatives. And so it may be that that a district attorney's self-evaluation of what's their job to do is sort of not to change laws, and that may lead to some of what we're seeing and make the over and above a coin flip level of representation, the congruence that we're getting, maybe even a pleasant surprise. For John's question about sort of long-term what's going on with American democracy, and he's got the answer for you, which is direct democracy. But I wanted to point to some empirical evidence for something that he threw out there, which is maybe it'll just take a little bit of time for people to catch up, right? And so Devin Coey and Chris Warshaw have a long-term project that's been published as well as articles and will be coming up to a major book that basically shows that, right? It does responsiveness, dynamic responsiveness over time, and it shows that it's incremental and it takes a while for policies to catch up, but they eventually get there. And that may be some of the correction you're seeing. I mean, we're only a decade into a time when voters are passing initiatives in California that reverse the tough on crime initiatives. There's some time to get us out of the politicians that we've elected beforehand and to catch up with that. And that may be coming with a wave of new folks. And then another possible explanation, though, for why it takes so long to get to perfect congruence, I think also comes from some really interesting work that's come out of Chris Tosanovich, and then he has a paper on the last election with Lynn Vavreck, also at UCLA, which basically shows that voters, there's some issues that are make or break issues for voters. And for conservative voters, like crime and policing is one of those make or break issues. So if you do factorial experiments, these are the things that they just won't budge on when they're evaluating candidates. So this is slightly different than an issue salience issue, but it may be that we're getting strong representation of the voters for whom, being tough on crime, going back to senior citizens who came up through these cohorts of high crime, these may be just the biggest issues for a group of voters who make this their single issue on which they decide on candidates. So it's not perfectly representative, but it's also not undemocratic.
Okay, and from the attendees, we have Christian Gross. I'm going to unmute him.
Thanks. Yeah, my question, I wrote it in the chat also, but it's related to what John was suggesting about low information elections. Like, so many of these DA races are basically about race and ethnicity. And if the candidates are not of the same ethnic group, they'll often split on racially polarized lines in terms of the way the vote goes. And so I was just thinking, have you looked at elections for DA where the candidates are of the same race or ethnic background? And perhaps those are more responsive than elections where the candidates are of different racial backgrounds, or maybe where the DA doesn't match the plurality group descriptively in the county.
So I have not. I do have a data set on people who ran over this period, or at least I think the last 2 cycles. I think I have the race and gender and ethnicity, so I could look at that. That's interesting. One thing I can tell you that I've done is, thinking about the LA race, I looked back at when Jackie Lacey was first elected and when that seat was open. I think it came down to her and another African-American ADA. I think it was a man. They were both pro-death penalty. He was actually a little more, he was actually a little less punitive. But if you look at like precinct level votes, people who were against the death penalty were more likely to pick Lacey. So the less punitive voters pick the more punitive candidate. And the punitive mismeasure is precinct level, so it obviously correlates a lot with race. This time around, it was the opposite. I mean, that block, obviously, the less punitive group really abandoned Lacey, and it was the reverse relationship. I don't know if that answers your question, but I have some data that might look at that more closely.
Yeah, no, that's related. I just was thinking that there's mostly what's happening in these races, other than the Lacey race in 2020, is actually about race and ethnicity in California elections.
Authors, have any responses to some of the earlier comments?
I did just want to say quickly to Liz that we do an event study where we kind of trace the effects of filing for bankruptcy over time. And it looks like for the spending variables, the effects really kick in about 3 years after filing, almost entirely across the board for all the different categories. And they persist really up until the end of our time series, which is, last year or whenever we had finished collecting data, 2019, I think. For the crime clearance rates, actually, the effect happens really before the spending variables. So we never really want to argue that the cuts in public safety spending cause public safety to become better at their jobs. We are just kind of saying that, both of these things happen after filing for bankruptcy, and one thing does not prevent the other thing from happening. But the crime clearance rates seem to increase faster than the public spending falls. So that tends to happen really right the 1 year after filing and tends to die out about 3 or 4 years after filing. So I don't know if that speaks a little to the concerns. But I guess also just quickly, because I know we're over time a little bit, but the larger question is also just, why would policymakers not want the option of giving themselves more options, right? Filing for bankruptcy doesn't force them to do anything. which I think speaks to John's point about this abrogation of contracts. They don't have to abrogate the contracts, but they can. No one is forcing them to do anything. So why wouldn't policymakers choose to have more options than they currently do? And that's kind of this puzzle, and figuring out, what actually winds up happening. What do they actually choose to do if they go down this route? It is the central thrust of the paper. So thank you all. Those are really excellent comments and appreciate them.
So I built in a half hour between the end of this panel and the book talk. That was a good idea on my part, I guess, because we went over. But we have 17 minutes, which is good. So we'll take a break and reconvene at 1:45 for Julia Payson's When Cities Lobby. Thanks again. Great panel.